Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on disaster risk financing meets adaptive social protection, maximizing the effects of shock response. I'm welcoming everyone and will start slowly until everyone arrives. My name is Veronica Bertram. I work as a lead risk finance advisor for the Center for Disaster Protection, which is an international organization who works on improving and upscaling their disaster risk finance. And I will be your facilitator today. This webinar is the 10th session of the Aspect series organized by GIZ and socialprotection.org. And the webinar series relies on a World Bank framework defining the 4 building blocks of adaptive social protection systems. We aim to bring experts and practitioners together to foster exchange on a global basis. And this webinar is situated at the heart of the 3rd building block, which is finances. Now let's move to the content of today's session. We will talk about the state of financing adaptive social protection in the world, but we will also look ahead and asking ourselves, how do we ensure that adequate financing mechanisms are in place to meet the needs of people who are facing more frequent and more severe shocks all around the globe? And in particular, which mechanisms are already in place and how to improve them and do the next step. To do so, we have invited a fantastic panel full of committed and highly knowledgeable speakers who will enlighten us with their perspectives and presentations, and then join the panel discussions towards the end of the session. To actively participate in this webinar, please post your questions and comments in the question box as we go, and we will try to feed them into the discussions. To kick off, I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters. The first one will be Alexander Jäger, Senior Specialist at the World Bank, seconded by GIZ. Then Felix Lung will speak. He's also a social protection specialist, also at the World Bank, based in Washington, DC, both of them. Then the third speaker, I'm really grateful to welcome Malda Mulla. He is the Scalable Coordinator at the National Local Government Finance Committee in Malawi and will present a very exciting case. And then Raja Nazaruddin, he's working with the United Nations University, the Institute for Environmental and Human Security, and he will also bring in a local perspective from the Caribbean. So with this, I would ask you, Alexander, to kick us off by framing the discussion around adaptive social protection and financing before we go into some country cases.
Okay, thanks very much, Veronica, for the introduction, and good morning and hello to everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I hope you can see me well. Is that fine? Good. So as Veronica already mentioned, my name is Alexander Jäger, and I was recently seconded from GIZ to the World Bank, specifically the Global Practice on Social Protection and Jobs. It is my pleasure to introduce the topic of the session today and prepare you for the great presentations to come. Next slide, please. As Veronica already did a little bit, I would like to begin with a crucial starting point of the global discussion these days. And these are the increasingly severe, interconnected, and often irreversible impacts of climate change on ecosystems, biodiversity, and human systems that increase the disaster risk landscape. While it is well known how human systems cause climate change by now and how we could potentially mitigate them, it is an ongoing discussion on how we as humans will react to these adverse impacts over time. And if this is true for both the slow onset side of climate change and the sudden onset extreme weather event side, causing the disasters which will be the focus of the session today. Let me emphasize that, of course, the risks from climate change are not the only risks to our societies. However, almost all the risks that our societies are dealing with, or the key risks, are amplified and are interacting with the consequences of climate change. May this be human health, may this be conflict, may this be economic downturns and nutrition. Next slide, please. Now, if we zoom into the realm of human systems that deal with disaster risks. Oh, no, just next slide. That is the old presentation, anyway. So if we zoom a bit into the human systems that are dealing with the impacts of climate change, and just with a few clicks that we see the rest of the slide, then immediately a few systems come up to our mind. So of course, disaster risk management, which kind of has a natural sequence and a natural relation to disaster risk. So it's about mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And then we have social protection systems that tackle risks from a more holistic long-term perspective. So here, this is a bit more heterogeneous. We are talking about social assistance that aims to reduce poverty and inequality. We have social insurance that tries to tackle lifetime shocks and changes. And we have labor market programs which aim to improve chances of employment and earnings, as well as income support during times of unemployment. After that, I have listed the financial systems because they will be at the center of our discussion today. So financial systems can largely be separated into public and private systems, and then along the different instruments and markets that follow. Linked to those three systems that will be in the focus today are things like the humanitarian sector that complements the disaster risk management, the environmental sector, of course, and the discussions, and depending on the situation, also the agricultural sector. Let me emphasize here that this kind of breaking down of systems, it's not just an academic exercise to understand the problem better, but it's a very real-life fact that we distinguish also our realms of action and our political organizations and ministry along those lines. And what we need to do is to really get into the shoes of each of those communities to understand where they are coming from and how they're reasoning and how they can support each other if we want to tackle the problems at hand. Next slide, please. Now, for today, I would like to focus on, and we will focus, of course, on the connection between social protection and disaster risk management systems. I've already mentioned the kind of natural flow of risk mitigation to risk preparedness, risk coping, and risk reduction. So that's what's often described as a cycle, but you can fold it out like that as well. Now, the question is, how do those different phrases relate to, and those activities relate to social protection systems? As we distinguish between social insurance, social assistance, and labor market programs, we also have a kind of inherent difference in how this relates to the changing climate. For the time being, the realm of social insurance is still the least connected, but with old age and health issues, this is bound to come over time. More in the focus are labor market programs already, especially under the topic of just transition, where we're discussing how will employment in climate change badly affecting industries such as coal, for example, coal mining. How will that change, and how will other industries come into play, such as renewable energies, and how will this shift, how can this shift be supported? However, most important for today is the connection between social assistance and disaster risk management, discussed today under the topics of disaster risk finance and adaptive social protection. The realm of finance actually pervades all this picture, and that's the third sector that I discussed earlier, or that I mentioned earlier. It pervades all those systems because everything needs to be financed. However, we are talking today about finance because financial instruments are used and can be used as an instrument for disaster risk management in case of direct payouts, or for social protection in the case of social insurance. But what we're discussing today is mostly cash payouts. Now, okay, please, next slide. Thanks so much. Now, I've tried to peel the onion a little bit, and we come now to the core of our discussions today. And at the core of our discussions today, disaster risk finance and adaptive social protection are money out and money in systems. With money out systems, I mean all the delivery systems that deliver actually the assistance to the people, so including the plans, the capacities in place, and the money to reduce the impacts that disasters have on our societies. And the money in systems, those are the systems that actually deliver the money and are tailored such that it is the right amount of money in the right way at the right time. Let us firstly look at the money out system, because it's very important that we know what we are using the money for. As a financial person, I really need to emphasize that we need to know what we need the money for. Otherwise, we won't be able to tailor the right financial instrument. And we really need to keep in mind that we need to design the financial aspects very, very closely with delivery systems, with all those technical interests and aspects. So those things need to evolve necessarily together. Some general principles, I guess you almost know this better than I do, for designing delivery systems in the case of adaptive social protection are that the new systems need to be aligned wherever possible and need to be building on existing protection systems wherever possible and improve them if necessary. As all this work, it needs to be considered ahead of time so that we are clear when the systems activate and how they will deliver the shock responsive support. And last but not least, it would be advisable if we build them such that it is trigger-based, rule-based, not up to an individual decision. On the right-hand side, I just briefly want to mention how delivery systems can be extended in the case of adaptive social protection. In the one way, we can consider to extend the amount of people and the population that is reached in the case of a disaster. So this is what we call horizontal expansion. And we can consider the amount that will be paid out. So what we call here a vertical expansion. So this is still a bit theory, but Mulder will fortunately dive into this a bit deeper in the real-life case of Malawi later. Now, please, the next slide. Now we've talked about delivery systems, and this slide is about the financial systems aspect, or the money in systems. So the financing instruments in place to supply, as I said, the right amount of money in the right way at the right time. Here we can distinguish different funding sources for the money. In general, we focus often on public funding sources, may it be national, bilateral, or multilateral, or private sources. So might this be individuals or businesses. And that is a bit more the focus in humanitarian activities. Then we have different thematic areas where the money comes from. It can be genuinely social protection. It can be disaster risk finance money, humanitarian sector, but also an increasingly climate finance. This is also a reason why we are so interested in this topic. Now, the different financial instruments we could talk about for days. I just want to briefly highlight a few aspects in what we call the risk layering. So in this graph that you see on the left-hand side so-called ex-ante instruments that are arranged before a disaster hits. On the right-hand side, the ex-post instruments, they're a bit more traditional and they are arranged after a disaster hits. Here, the general difference is that we assume that ex-ante instruments, on the one hand, pay out faster because they have been arranged before, and they are cheaper, either because we aligned them better politically in advance, the alignment with other political priorities, or because the financial markets are more forgiving and they give you better rates before something hits than after it hits. Now, so mostly today we will be talking about those ex-ante instruments, and the presentations will be talking especially about contingent credit and macro and meso insurance and microinsurance. Yeah, but in order to explain to you a little bit of difference on the left side, I would like to give you a few examples, because what you see here on the left axis is also the difference between higher frequency and lower frequency instruments. That meaning that some of those instruments are more ideal for high frequency events, so often occurring events, often occurring natural phenomena, and some are more tailored towards lower frequencies. That means events and disasters that happen very rarely. No? So when we have higher frequency, then it's good to use the money that you have at hand. And classic would be budget allocation. No? So budget allocation would be that often in an annual cycle, the government allocates money to a certain budget for certain purposes, and there are certain conditions under which this budget can be used. The money is relatively cheap because there is no external party involved. The highest costs are actually the opportunity costs, meaning that you can't spend that money on anything else but this very purpose. You can't spend it on education or health, for example, if you have reserved it for disasters. This also limits the amount of money, naturally, because you want to invest in health and in education, but it limits the amount you can reserve for disasters. We can compare this, for example, to insurance. That's definitely an instrument that should not be used on a yearly, annual basis, but it should rather cover events that only occur every 5, 10, 50, or even 100 years. Why? Because insurance includes a lot of, entails a lot of administrative costs, but other costs such as margins for risk or taxes and profit margins in case it is organized privately. But insurance is very helpful because it can build up money over time. So when the event comes after 5, 10, or 50 years, you actually have the money in place. So you have saved it up and you have a legal right to avail this money. Okay, I stop here. I know I've already talked quite a bit. I stop here. I would love to take more into detail about the different instruments, but fortunately we have a lot of interesting presentations to come, with Felix talking more about the principles, and Mulder and Raja will be talking more about the processes and real-life experiences. So I hope that was of help, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for setting the stage and introducing the principal concept of how to link social protection to disaster risk finance. And I'm really happy and excited to listen now to Felix, who wrote a super exciting paper on the myth about DRF in the context of adaptive social protection. And yeah, I hand over to you, Felix.
Thanks a lot, Veronica. Thanks a lot, Alexander. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. Let's hope we can make it worth your while. My name is Felix Lung. I'm a social protection specialist at the World Bank, working mostly in the West African Sahel. Next slide, please. So I work in a program that's called the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program, which is a program that's active in the 6 countries that you can see on the map. And it's a program by the World Bank, supported by various donors, that essentially supports each of these countries, the governments in these countries, to develop national adaptive safety nets across the 4 pillars that were already mentioned, being institutions and partnerships, so things such as government leadership, ability to frame this appropriately in the national systems, programs and delivery systems. So there we're talking about payment systems, delivery systems of social protection systems, data and information, being early warning systems, national registries, and finally finance. And that's obviously what we're talking about today. We have gathered some sort of initial, some experiences and lessons in working on finance in these 6 countries that I want to share today with you. Next slide, please. So what basically prompted this paper was that what we noticed in working in the West African Sahel, in these countries, on the topic of disaster risk finance for adaptive social protection, was that there's obviously a variety of different factors that make the Sahel different from other contexts, and which also then have an influence over how disaster risk finance should be approached in this context. So this includes that there is a particularly high vulnerability to different shocks. So we're obviously talking not only about droughts, we're talking about floods, we're talking about conflict, price shocks that have a huge influence, high levels of chronic food insecurity. If you think about countries such as Niger or Chad, where chronic food insecurity is as high as 1/3 of the population. Safety nets in the region are so far of limited coverage, maybe with the exception of Mauritania and Senegal, but certainly for sort of the central Sahelian countries, the safety net coverage is still quite limited. Institutional capacity is a challenge sometimes, considering that these are obviously vast countries which are often also affected by conflict, and thus difficult to have the institutional capacity everywhere in the country. Limited data availability, and finally, limited government fiscal space, which obviously in the context of finance is important. Next slide, please. So I just want to quickly present 5 takeaways that we had from working in this institutional setting. The first being, well, quite broad, but I think it's nonetheless important to realize, being that disaster risk finance is broader than just financial instruments. So if you look at what we define as DRF, there's a definition by the Center for Disaster Protection, which I like, which says disaster risk financing covers the system of budgetary and financial mechanisms to credibly pay for a specific risk arranged before a potential shock. So what you might think just from the term disaster risk finance, or this definition as well, disaster risk finance is all about setting up financial instruments such as, and that's often insurance or funds or cat bonds or other things. But in fact, it's a lot broader, because a lot of things need to be in place before you can actually arrive at the financing bit. So this is firstly the need to understand and prioritize risk. So without having a real understanding of what risk you're dealing with, you cannot put in place a financing solution. This is the contingency planning. So thinking about what is it that you finance? So in the case of adaptive social protection, this would be scaling up or scaling out of national systems. This would be definitive rules for when do you actually activate. And there's various examples of this could either be governed by objective triggers, for example, through satellite rules or others, or it could be soft triggers. Then there is a need to analyze the actual needs and then the final putting in place of instruments. So you see, all these things need to work in together. And so you can't just put in place the financial instruments. So that's a pretty broad lesson that applies in other contexts as well, but I think it's nonetheless important to remember. Next slide. So the second then, if you think about the Sahel, where the safety nets coverage is still quite limited, one of the things that really became important for us is this realization that in order to put in place an effective financing system, you really need to have first an effective safety net in place to be able to have something that you finance. Because if you don't, you might have a financing instrument, a financing mechanism in place that will provide financing in the event of a disaster, in the event of a crisis. But if there is no delivery mechanism, you might frustrate the response altogether, or you might perpetuate other already existing response mechanisms that you that actually might not want to be targeted in this instance. And given that implementation is difficult in a fragile context, that is something that is particularly important in these contexts to remember. Sometimes something that our experience is not always sort of taken into account when planning for disaster risk financing instruments in this context. Next slide. The third takeaway that we had is that it might make sense to think about disaster risk financing specifically in the context of adaptive social protection. So if you look at how the disaster risk financing agenda has taken off in other regions, such as in Latin America, and if you think about Colombia or Panama, or East Asia, if you think about the Philippines, there are many times governments have sort of first started putting in place a national strategy for disaster risk finance, thinking about how do we finance for all types of shocks in all sectors for all types of risks, which is difficult often in fragile contexts because there is a lack of data, especially in the Sahel. You have many risks that are also difficult to quantify. If you think about food price shocks, if you think about conflict shocks, and the institutions are in many places actually not geared towards disaster response. They're geared towards food security response, which there's obviously an important overlap, but it's not always the same. And so one of the things that we are taking away is that it might actually make more sense to think about how do we, if we have a particular adaptive safety net, a particular scalable mechanism that is worth financing, how can we put in place a mechanism that will finance that rather than something that finances the entirety of the country's exposure? And if you think about also countries, we'll hear about the Malawi case. I think this is one case where it was done similarly. If you think about the Kenya case, there it's a bit different, but nonetheless, there's also a strong focus on ASP. Next slide. Another thing that we're taking away in the Sahel is that given that the Sahel, and I think that's applicable to other countries as well, sort of in particularly vulnerable, fragile contexts, that the Sahel is strongly exposed to various different shocks, and vulnerability is extremely high. We mentioned chronic food insecurity, and so on and so forth. However, if you think about the disaster financing mechanisms that have so far actually been implemented in the region, there is a strong focus on insurance. If you think there is the African Risk Capacity, ARC Replica, agriculture insurance programs in the region. And one thing we're learning is that as these shocks, sort of that insurance tends to be most cost effective for obviously the more extreme layers of risk, more infrequent extreme types of risk, which are also more expensive to finance. Whereas sort of these more frequent, less intense shocks can nonetheless, in a context such as in the Sahel, throw millions into food insecurity. And there should just thus also be a stronger focus in terms of the financial instruments being used on what we call risk retention, risk reserve mechanisms, such as funds. And Alexander already mentioned a few of those. That's something, so where in the countries that we're engaged in, we're, for example, working with governments also on strengthening national risk retention mechanisms that can play a role for financing ASP. And next slide. This is my final slide. So final takeaway is one thing that many external actors sometimes hope for disaster risk financing to achieve is that it can help countries to, in the medium term, take on the cost for responding to disasters completely themselves without continued external assistance. I think in a context such as the Sahel, it's important to realize that this is not likely to happen in the medium term, given just the extreme fiscal constraints that many of the countries in the regions are under, and given the high and rising costs and already existing dependency on external support for responding to disasters. So it's also important here to understand the limitations of what disaster risk financing can do. It can obviously help in increase the efficiency, the effectiveness of financing, but it will not be able to entirely shift the burden onto countries themselves. And this is something important also for external partners to remember. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Felix. I would now hand over first to the next presenter, and then we will take all the questions after all the presenters presented their case. But to everyone, please keep your questions in mind. It's also great to also to see the many questions already in the Q&A box, which I take note of. And now I will hand over to Mulder, who will present his experiences in Malawi. Over to you, Mulder.
Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. My name is Mulder Mputmula from Malawi. I'll look at the presentation based on the Malawian case. Next slide, please. So just a background on how we respond to shocks in Malawi. In most of the cases, as Alexander has already mentioned, is that we are more reactive than proactive. At the end of the day, if you look at the challenges that we are facing, like for example, in Malawi, we have a lot of shocks, floods, drought, stormy rains, strong winds, hailstones. And how do we respond? In most of the cases, we use the ex-ante, ex-post, whereby we wait until the end of the disaster or the shock. Then we started looking for resources. Which at the end of the day is not good for the economy because we reallocate a lot of resources to respond to a disaster. Of late, that's when now we are becoming more and more proactive in our way of responding to the disasters. However, we noticed that the readiness of the system, because the humanitarian action is on and the social protection, they work on their own. We look at the vulnerability or the agency of how to handle that. It takes time. Next slide, please. Now, experience has shown that the faster support can reach the poor and vulnerable before a disaster or just after the disaster, likely they are to resort to negative coping strategies. Here, for example, if we take more than 72 hours or more than that, what happens is that the assets that the people have accumulated over a period of time, they start selling those assets in order to sustain their lives. And we have noted that adaptive social protection can provide more integrated approach to risk disaster response with a longer term reduction of vulnerability to the climate change. If you look at, as Alexander already mentioned, when you look at the way we respond, it's more like if you look at the humanitarian, it's more of short term or medium term. But when you look at what we have noted for the past 2 years that we have been working on scalable mechanism is that it provides us with a long-term solution. So in short, what we're saying is that these adaptive social protection financing can also complement climate financing. There is no competition between the two. That's what we have noted. Next slide, please. So in Malawi, this is how the social support for resilient livelihood project is like. So these are just the components that are there. We have component 1, improve the socio-economic inclusion. 2 is strengthening harmonized delivery systems, capacity building and institutional strengthening. And also what we have is contingency emergency response component. So all these, they work together in order for us to provide for the vulnerable and the ultra poor. Next slide, please. So the main issue that I would like to talk to you today about is on the scalable mechanism. Now, this is a mechanism that enables the government to transfer funds to the most vulnerable households in the response to drought, to avoid the near poor slipping into poverty cycle, the poor and ultra poor to go further down the poverty line or to be trapped in the poverty line. So the scalable mechanism uses existing social structures. So what we're trying to do here is that we use both vertical and horizontal expansion. Now, if you look on your right on the slide, we have horizontal expansion and vertical expansion. Now, on vertical expansion, what happens is that the regular social cash transfer beneficiaries or households, what we do is we just increase the amount that they receive. So if you are on social cash transfer already, and we have triggered, for example, drought payments, what will happen is that we just top up on your regular amount that you are receiving per month. While at the same time, the adaptive social protection, it allows us to add more households. Because when you look at like Malawi, the poverty line is so high, whereby if you look at it, you find that it's on about 10% per district that are under social cash transfers. So there are a lot of people who are ultra poor, but because of the criteria, some of them, they may look as better off. But when a shock happens, it does not look at whether the person is under social cash transfers or not. If, for example, if a flood occurs, it affects everyone. When a drought occurs, it affects everybody. So the horizontal expansion allows us to add more households so that we can be able to reach out to them before the shock. So if you look at this, what happens now is that the additional households, they only receive the amount that is a top up on the regular social cash transfer beneficiaries. So if, for example, if you get a regular social cash transfer beneficiary is getting $3, for argument's sake, and we are topping up with $7, it makes it $10. So the horizontal expansion beneficiaries or additional households will only get $7. Next slide, please. Now, here is, I just want to give a clear picture when it comes to the financing. So the district, at first, we started with 3 districts because it's just like initial start. So we started with 3 districts, Blantyre, Choro, and Nchewu. We are doing both, in all of these districts, we are doing both vertical and horizontal expansion. The type of financing that we have in Malawi is that we have a flexible project contingency financing, around $20 million. And also we have a funding of premium sovereign risk transfer instruments. Here we are talking about the insurance. We would like to take insurance against the drought. As I mentioned earlier on, we focused on drought because it's easier for us to predict that in this area, there will be a drought, in that district, there will be a drought, rather than the floods. But this year and next year, we are adding on 2 other flood-prone districts. So we are working on the models on how to trigger. The triggers, we have 2 primary triggers. These are based on satellite indices to capture the impact of drought. So we have what we call the primary triggers and secondary triggers or evidence review triggers. The primary triggers we monitor from November, 1st November, because that's the first of the agricultural period, 1st November up to 31st January for the early drought indices. Then we have a full drought indices whereby we monitor from 1st November up to the end of the rainy season, which is in March. So sometimes, because we're using satellites, it may predict that, it may show that in that area there was rainfall. When you go on the ground, there's no rainfall. That's why we are using secondary trigger or evidence review trigger. Next slide, please. So here I'm just trying to show you the insurance that you will work to take for the next 2 or 3 years. You may wonder why we have two, because we believe that risk rearing, what is happening here is that one instrument cannot be enough to cover everything. So we're trying to combine both contingency financing and also parametric insurance transfers, whereby we were about to get an insurance from one of the insurance providers. All these are in a kind of grants. We get the grant from the World Bank, with help from the World Bank for both. And the parametric is from the global risk financing, what we call GRIF. Next slide, please. Now here is just giving an example of, I won't dwell much on this one because here is just giving you a glimpse of what is happening in Malawi. So if you look at, I'll give you, for example, one district, which is Blantyre. If you look at VE households, as of February 2021, there are only 8,160. That's 10% of the district population, rural area. If you look at the additional households, that means if you add, we get about 10,500. So this year, we have reached out to 18,694 households. Then the other remaining 3 districts at the bottom, those are the districts that we have added on that we're going to do this year to the 3. That means this year we're going to do 6 districts in total. Then next year we'll also increase the number as we're moving on, because the first 3, it was more of a learning period. Now we are graduating and moving forward, then we'll be increasing the total of the number of districts. Next slide, please. So what happens is that in terms of funds disbursement, we had about 5 billion Malawian kwacha, or around $5 million US, and we reached out to 74,638 households. Now, each household per month was getting about 25,000 Malawian kwacha for a period of 3 months. So as I mentioned earlier on, the V beneficiary got the regular amount plus the top up, while the HE beneficiary only received the scaling up amount. Now the amount was based on food basket that we get from our colleagues from MVAC. So they give us the amount, then we said, okay, this is the food basket for this period of time. In terms of disbursement of the funds, we use two modalities to reach out to the communities on the ground. That is e-wallet, the bank and mobile money providers, and also in areas where the systems are not ready, we use manual disbursement. In terms of targeting, how did we target? The households, we use the two things. The households should be labor constrained, child-headed families, female-headed families, or elderly, but all of them have to be ultra poor. At the same time, timing of disbursement, what we did this year is that we designed after monitoring that after the rainy season, and we predict that there will be a drought, we started disbursement of the cash. Why we did that is because soon after the rainy season, when people harvested, they got the prices of the maize at a cheaper price. They are able to buy maize at a cheaper price, and the prices are lower. Next slide, please. So as Alexander already mentioned, I think I won't dwell much on this one. What we have done is that we have used the existing social structures to speed up disbursement. For example, if you look at, we have used a harmonized e-payment system. So instead of us going around to scale up, to spinning at the wheel again, inventing another wheel, what we did was just to harmonize the e-payment, harmonize the grievance redress mechanism, and also using the social registry. So it was easier for us to use all these because they are already existing. That's why it was so fast for us. Next slide, please. These are some of the challenges and the key, the lesson learned. But on the ground, what I can say is that, since my time is almost out, what I can say is that when you look at the adaptive social protection, it changes the dynamics, because this year, for example, we have worked with the humanitarian on lean season response. So what has happened is that we have seen that there is a good interaction between the humanitarian and also the social protection, whereby the two can complement each other rather than working in silos, whereby you'll see the humanitarian doing this and the social protection doing that. Yet at the same time, you're targeting the same community, the same people, the same household. So we have seen that one of the challenges is that fragmented finance mechanism. But of recently, we have noted that the government of Malawi, with the donors, have signed a multi-donor trust fund, whereby now all the resources will be put from the donor partners will be used. So we are sure that we are hoping and we're sure that we'll get some of the resources for the scalable mechanism. I think that's my last slide. I will wait for the questions later. Over.
Thanks so much, Mona, for your presentation. Lots of questions went in, very exciting. And now I hand over to Raja. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Veronica. Good afternoon, everyone. Good mornings. Waiting for my slide. All right, perfect. Thank you. My name is Raja. I'm working with Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. We are a non-profit think tank. We develop a solution on climate insurance. We work in developing countries, and we support to develop a product, especially to have access for vulnerable and low-income communities. And next, please. So today what I will do is I will share a little bit how the parametric insurance, based on the project we are implementing, and also show you the product that we developed. One is in the Caribbean, which I'm leading the project, and also ones in the Pacific, and how these two different products. And probably if you see what Alex mentioned earlier, so the product or the solution that we are developing is specifically for ex ante, which is a pre-arranged products. And also Mulder was mentioning about parametric instrument, and that is more macro, but the product that we are developing is a micro product. So it's not for the government, but I mean directly for this a small farmer, for example, they can have, but whoever who can have it. So parametric insurance, imagine if you have like a normal insurance, indemnity insurance, like health insurance you have, or asset insurance like house insurance or car insurance. Normally what happens is when it's an accident happens, so you pay for the cost, or the insurance company, and then will verify and do like a physical assessment, and then they will pay for the damages. But parametric insurance is a type of insurance that payout happen when it's triggered on based on the pre-agreed event, and this is related to I mean, like we talk about weather-based insurance is based on, for example, wind speed and also rainfalls. So in this case, in our product, the policyholders can receive the money or pay out within 2 weeks. It could be faster as well. And the payment is provided by insurance firm. It's not like government products, and can be made digitally. So the monies go directly with bank transfer and also digital wallets. Next, please. Thank you. So this is one project we have in Caribbean, and I will take one product examples, and we have this product in Jamaica. So the project is implemented by different partners. You can see we have MCI and also CRIF SPC, which is risk pools, regional risk pools, catastrophe, Caribbean catastrophe risk insurance facilities. And Felix mentioned about African risk facilities, so that is the same. They are in the Caribbean, and also we work together with ILO Impact Insurance and DHI. So DHI is a modeler to develop insurance, weather insurance, and University West Indies. The local universities conduct assessments, willingness to pay, and where's the vulnerabilities, location, for examples. And the underwriters, the insurance, regional insurance guardian, general insurance, which is located to those 5 pilot countries. And the project is supported by the German government's BMUVs, or International Climate Initiative. So I would just want to explain a little bit how the products look like. And this is micros, and please bear with me, it's quite complex. And Felix was mentioning earlier that it's very important to have understanding risk and then make priorities. This is for these regions, the product is for wind speed and the rainfalls. And the product is designed based on the location, for example, because the product learned on weather data in the last 60 years, and there we can see when this hurricane happened, which location is more damages. And the policy is also having a different price on different locations. So the product also designed with different premiums, so people can choose, for example, with 6,600 until 66,000, you can see. And also they have a different triggers, right? So if, let's say one example, so someone bought a premium for 6,600. So if they are located in one's area or parish, they call it Hanover, for example. If the wind is triggered for on a 50 mile per hour, yeah, and then they will get 13% payout. So this product is being launched already in 2016, and now we refine to develop more better products, and another product will be launched before the hurricane season this year. And if you see, the premium is different, and also the payout range is different. And then this product is a market-based product. People can buy in the market and not how to say, like, targeted to specific crop. So it's not like rice insurance, for instance. So taxi driver can buy this insurance. And for example, a tourist worker can buy this insurance. It could be targeted in one and based on this location. So if people in this parish, they can buy these products. Next, please. Another product example that I want to give you is our project in the Pacific. So this project is implemented together with the UNCDF and UNDPs and targeted these following countries: Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Samoa, Solomon Islands, and also Papua New Guinea. At the moment, we are at the piloting space, and the product are quite similar, but I mean, like, the trigger is different. It's based on locations, as I said earlier, and also based on like local hazard or local risk. And the product also the same, is based on wind speed. And if you see, for examples, category 1, let's say, so its wind speed is 109, between 190 and 154. So they will get, like, if locations, that's quite different. It's based on the distance to the eye of cyclones. So if location is between within 25 kilometers, so they will get payout $30, for instance. So this different product is this this two different product is designed based on the natures or the vulnerability of hazard in the particular place. And this flexibility also create a different payout, for examples, and based on what people need there. And of course, as I said earlier, we did a lot of assessment, and based on the assessment and how much that people willing to pay, and how is the economic category, for example, then they create a product. Of course, then the product will not cover everything, but this is adjusted for smallholders, farmer, and fishers. And the product, if you see from the range of payout, a premium is only $14. And then the range of payout is between 14 and 174. I mean, like, it's not like a big amount, but this is a very helpful when the monies come, or payout is come very quick. And these projects is a support by the government of Australia, New Zealand, and also Indian UN Development Partnership Fund. Next, please. All right, so why is linking these particular micro instruments with social protections? So what we're trying to do is we engage with the government, and this product is already in the market, and we see there is some limitation of the product, and then we want to refine to improve the product. And right now, as I said earlier, we want to relaunch the product before hurricane season this year, which is before June. And in the Caribbean, the government showed interest to support a premium subsidies for selected beneficiaries, and particularly Ministry of Social Affairs and Ministry of Agriculture. If you see, for example, they are particularly farmers who located in to expose to certain hazards, and then the government could, for example, help them or subsidize this particular group with these market products. So the government is not creating a new product by themselves, or the government would not create, not subsidize the product based on its state budget, but mostly the government take the product is already in the market, right? So we plan in 2023, this year when we launch, then we work with the government and how this product could be linked and with the social protection mechanisms or their strategies. And one in the Pacific is very interesting, so what happened in Fiji. So the product is there, the one that I showed you before, and in 2001, and the Department of Social Affairs and his Ministry of Women, Children, and Property Alleviations, we supported WFP in 2001. They tried with 274 selected social welfare beneficiaries. And this is new product, and seeing how the product work. And in 2002 November, the government scaled up this support to 2,000. And this, of course, is again based on where these existing beneficiaries located. So there are some locations, for example, is really prone to cyclones or hurricanes. So the government can see that it would be particular target these particular communities or beneficiaries with this premium support. Next, please. And I'm always telling you about benefit, but I mean, like, here's, I want also to bring downsides of a benefit and downside of parametric microinstruments. So the benefit, the first benefit is a quick payout. I mean, like, compared to the indemnity, the normal insurance type, these parametrics, I mean, in the Caribbean in 2017, 16, people receive money in 72 hours. So it's the payment is quick. People can get cash quickly. And the indemnity could take months, or sometimes it take years for payouts, right? And also the flexible. So the triggers of payouts are designed for many different needs. For example, if I mentioned earlier with 2 different products, so if you see, we create a product with these particular groups because our project targeting low income and vulnerable communities. Low income, they have a certain economic situations and with willingness to pay, and then we can, for example, create with these certain premiums and with this certain payout. So that's the flexible, and also based on hazard or risk. So we see what is what kind of risk that we want to create the solution for. Is I mean, in the Caribbean is exposed to hurricanes, and in the Pacific is also cyclone. Maybe different case in Africa is mostly drought, as the mentioned, is like in Sahel will be a different case. And then it's, that is kind of flexibility. And also what I see as example in Caribbean and Pacific is market-based products. So learning from different insurance products, for example, Indonesia, where originally came from, the government support, like agriculture insurance is 100% subsidized, and it's 100% depend on government budget. I mean, market-based insurance, everyone can buy. And if they are rich, they also can buy because that is in the market. And then if they are poor, if the government wants to support the particular community, then the government can subsidize premium for this group. But what I want to say is it's not like a government run and not depend on a government budget. And the one interesting as well or benefit for this type of insurance is the government can scale up. So it's in case of Fiji, for instance, the government can try with 274 and then see, and the next the government can also pay 2,000 for 2,000 beneficiary, for instance, and so that the government is not investing in developing a product or programs. And here, if we see the area where it's depend on agriculture's product, let's say it's like milk producers are farmers, mostly the milk producers coming from small farmers, right? And then this is they sell it to the big companies. So big companies could, for example, as in terms of cooperative, for example, they can take this insurance for their cooperative members, right? So this is for meso level, and also flexible for micro level. So anyone, if for example, own one shop in some tourist area, so they want to buy this insurance because when the rain happen or when cyclone happen, no tourists will come, and then to protect their financials, finance, so they can buy this insurance. And one disadvantage or downside of this insurance is a basis risk. As I see earlier, it's like the payout is based on triggers. So when the trigger is not achieved, payout, right? So the trigger is sometimes giving a different impact. It depends on how strong is your building when it comes to the stores, right? Or how strong is your plant when it comes to agriculture. Bananas and a coconut would be different when the wind speed is 100 kilometers per hour. Right, so that is a basis risk. So when the trigger, let's say 100 kilometers per hour, but the wind speed is 99 kilometers per hour, and then they will not get a payout. So this is a basis risk. Is one thing that put in mind, which is also important to educate the potential clients. Next, please. Right, so that is also my presentation. I'm happy to answer this question when it comes. Next, thanks a lot. Back to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Raja, for your examples from the Pacific and the Caribbean. We now have 20 more minutes roughly with Q&As, and I would like to raise a couple of questions which were written in the Q&A box, and I will start with Mulder because so many questions were actually asked about more details about how the Malawi social safety net was tailored to become shock responsive. So I will start with Mulder and share one or two questions which I think are related on targeting. How does the targeting mechanism for the horizontal expansion work? What are the eligibility criteria? That's the first question. And the second one, which is related, is did the humanitarian actors use the registry list to target their beneficiaries, or did they do their own registrations? And are you sure to avoid the overlap of both approaches? Thank you.
Thanks for those two questions. The first one is how the additional beneficiary targeted. There are two elements, two categories, because we have other districts where we have 100% registry of beneficiaries. So in those districts where we have 100% registered members of the community, what happens is that we just go into the social registry and pick up from there, because we use PMT. While in other districts whereby we are less than 100%, because we are remaining with 5 or 6 districts to reach 100%. So what happened is that we use the JFAP method, whereby we use the community targeting. Then after community targeting, what we did was to use the emergency information management systems. Then when we have the list after PMT, when you have the list, what happened is that we went back to the community for verification. So that's how we use the additional registry for the additional households. For the humanitarian, the challenge is that we're going towards the same, that they should be using the social registry. However, the challenge is that it's so expensive for us to keep on updating it almost every year. Because for humanitarian to use that, that means they need it to be updated almost every year. While for social support, it's about 5 years. So you can do the case management, all that. So what the humanitarian mostly use is that they just use a JFAP, community targeting, and then verification and all that. So to avoid duplication or double dipping, what we did like this year, as I mentioned, is that we come together as Malawi, the humanitarian and the social support. So we bring our resources together and we say, okay, for example, under VE, how many are in this district? So the social support in districts whereby we were doing cash transfers. That means the social support will do the cash transfers. The remaining number of affected communities during the lynch season period, what happened is that the humanitarian were taking over that number. In so doing, there was no duplication of the list of the names, and we didn't have any double dipping. I think I've answered the 2 questions. Have I left one?
Thank you so much. You answered both questions. Very exciting and interesting to see how to make it happen to have a harmonized approach as much as possible, probably from a national planner's point of view. I share the next question to Felix. Felix, what would you summarize as the key lessons that other countries can take from the SASPP as they craft policies and strategies for an adaptive social protection financing system? Over to you.
Thanks, Veronica. So I think there's a lot of different lessons that sort of can be shared, but I don't know, just maybe 1 or 2. So one, I think any engagement on financing for adaptive social protection, and in fact for designing such a system it is worth starting it with a quantitative risk assessment, with a comprehensive assessment, understanding what are the types of risk, what are the most important risks, what are their impacts, and not only to understand better the risk and then be able to decide what are the risks that one wants to tackle through this ASP program, but also to have a better understanding of the risk profile and thus what instrument might be best suited to address those risks in terms of financial instruments. So this might sometimes be insurance, but it might in other cases actually not be insurance. And so I think having a good understanding of that first, rather than immediately jumping to the instrument, which is something we sometimes see in some countries, is something that I think is very important. Then maybe second point, and I think I mentioned this in the presentation, is that I think it is very useful to ensure when, especially with a focus on financing, yes, it's important to think financing from the start, as I think Alexander mentioned in this presentation, and to plan both together. But at the same time, there is no point in setting up a financing approach if you don't have a mechanism that can actually deliver those payments to beneficiaries. So in the case of a safety net, of a scalable safety net, this would be a scalability component that is able to scale horizontally or scale vertically, that should be capable of doing so first. And many countries already have that, but some countries actually don't. And where you don't, and you set up a financial instrument, then payouts from that instrument can actually, in some cases, perpetuate other mechanisms that may be less effective than the safety net, and not achieve the intended objectives. And then maybe finally, I think it's definitely best practice, and we've seen this in other countries, to sort of first think about comprehensively about risk and set up a comprehensive national strategy to say, these are all the risks, this is how we're going to respond to them, this is how we're going to finance each part of that risk. But in some countries, it can be, for whatever type of reason, be very difficult to actually achieve that. It can be politically difficult, it can be institutionally difficult, the risks cannot lend themselves to that type of analysis. So in those cases, what we sort of saw in the Sahel is it might actually be more useful to start bottom up. So to focus first on financing a specific program, such as an ASP program, and then sort of extend that knowledge and that experience then also to other sectors. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Felix, for elaborating a bit further on the recommendations for other contexts. I will move on with two questions for Raja on the Pacific context. The first question was, what share of poor household income would you say the parametric microinsurance premiums are in the examples you mentioned, so with and without the government subsidy? And related to that, my personal question would be, how does this relate to social protection solutions, if you can answer that? And the second question, which came in, is with the government in Fiji subsidizing the premium, are there other mechanisms being used for social protection? Does the insurance payout cover the loss that may be suffered by the vulnerable households in case of an adverse event? Thank you.
Thanks for Pranav to addressing the questions. Right. So with these two products that I was mentioned earlier, is the one in Caribbean, we don't have this product this year in the market because we improved this product with data. As I mentioned earlier, with basis risk, because the data accuracy also is very important when it comes to parametric insurance. So we will launch this before these hurricane season this year. And so this data, I mean, like we don't have these portions, right? So I also answers on the box that, I mean, like I would be happy to share it later in the Pacific, and that's at least with my colleagues. But answering your question, Veronica, when it comes to parametric insurance and social protection, I think it's really interesting to see from like a sectoral perspective. If, for example, the government have different subsidized based program, right? So it's like they have social protection element in it. Let's say Ministry of Agriculture, they subsidize a certain group of farmers. So then it could go when it comes to parametric insurance. So this farmer group can be supported with a premium, or fishers can be supported with a premium. If it depends, if the island is like a tourist island, so tourist workers could be supported with this kind of insurance, because this livelihood protection policy is not targeting crop, it's not targeting what type of livelihood you have, but it's a really general, and then the government can see benefit from that. And from Fiji, that I want to go back to Pranav, then about the payout, about the program. Again, if we see what Alex drew earlier, right, with this layering approach. So insurance is not a silver bullet. It's not one answer to all solution for all problem. So insurance, particularly micro insurance, is just like a support, like a small amount from, for example, if you do risk layering exercise for one country. So that is true in Fiji. The government have a different social protection programs, and insurance is just one that could answer particularly in particular areas. And then we are I'm happy that the one that in Fiji just the payout just triggered, and that's very fresh, it's still very fresh, and we don't have this how to say, it's like comprehensive information yet where or how people will use their money, because the money directly go to policyholders, because it's different with what Mulders mentioned earlier. Is parametric insurance for the government, and then the government can allocate money for, could be emergency response, could be a cash transfer, for instance. But this type of insurance or micro insurance go directly to the person. So how they decide to use the monies, then we need to go back to them, and then we need to make another studies, and we see how they will allocate the money. Either they want to, for example, support reconstructions, or they'll support their kid needs, and then we need to make after the payout. Thanks.
Thanks, Raja, also for reminding myself about the different concepts of how to actually reach the poor and affected, right? Which can be very different and can rather have a public or private sector approach. Thanks so much. I will there are so many questions, so I will just continue raising these, and the next one again will be for Mulder. So many people interested in the Malawi case who just came live, as I understood. The question is, with regard to the Malawi case study, how are cascading and compounding hazard risks incorporated in the ASP, so the social protection net, with regard to HE inclusion? How are most vulnerable populations involved in such as CTP schemes? And I understood it's broad so far, so the big question is about the future. My personal addition to this question. Thank you.
Okay, for the future, I think that was your question. What was your question again?
So basically, additional risks. So far, the shock resilient component is drought risk, as I've understood. So how do you plan to? So are there any plans for the future? Is it a pilot? The classical social protection net is independent from the drought shock, as I understood. So how do you deal with the expansion of the resilience component, considering having in mind there are so many shocks, you could also, add a resilience layer to that. Is that clear now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So for scalable mechanism, we focus only on drought. However, if you recall on the presentation where I was talking about the components, we have what we call contingency emergency response component. Now that component covers all other shocks. So what happens is that under the social support resilience livelihood program, we have, for example, this year we had additional financing. Now, what we have done is that under this component, we have put in some resources. So, for example, if we have now we have a case of cholera. Last year we had a case, the past 2 years we had a case of COVID-19. So what happens, these other shocks, we scale up from that component. So we have two components which are different from that. For scalable mechanism, it's only for drought. And as I already mentioned that we have picked one district that we are trying to pilot for floods, because Malawi has got a lot of floods in most of the district. But we have that component, emergency response component, whereby we can respond to any other shock using the resources from that component. So we have those two areas that we can use for responding to the shocks.
Thanks so much, Mulder, for explaining a bit more on the future. I will take another question, which is rather on the systemic or process level, to Felix. So if time is available, it would be good to know if any systems described here have a grievance redress mechanism and if they work well.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica, and thanks for the great question. It's, so of the programs that I mentioned in the West African Sahel, every program has a grievance redress mechanism. It's actually a requirement for any World Bank project. And so do they work well? I think it varies, I would say. In some cases, there are challenges. I think, and one of the lessons, just to give you an example, in Niger, for example, one of the lessons we're learning is that it is, especially in contexts where institutional capacity across a vast area is not always a given, it is not necessarily always sufficient to have decentralized grievance redress committees, which is something that that we used to do, or that the program used to do. And so what we're doing there, for example, we're supporting the government in establishing a mechanism that is supported centrally as well. So there is what we call a green line, a ligne verte, so basically a free hotline that people can call either to share information about the program or to file their complaint, and which then gets fed into the program system in order for it to be resolved. So while also maintaining the decentralized approach. So that's something we're learning, and by sort of having this double approach of having a central approach and having a decentralized approach at the same time, we're learning that's a more effective approach for handling complaints. And actually, so just to add, so one of the future visions for these GRM programs that we're also supporting in some of the countries is that the GRM will not only be used for the single safety net, but sort of across programs in the social protection sector, in order to use economies of scale, and in order to gather, make information handling and management more effective and efficient. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks so much, Felix. And I have a look at the time, and it looks like we need to come to an end already. And I would like to thank every one of you for having the time to prepare and to join us and to share with us your experiences and thinking about how to move social protection systems towards shock resilience. Really a special thank you to the great presenters, but also to everyone who came and listened and raised questions. So the organizing team will provide the answers within a day to all the questions which weren't discussed here. And also the video from the session will be at the event page, and people can listen in even if you have only joined a part of the session. Please make some time to fill out the survey to this webinar, as your feedback will help to improve and pick up topics that are relevant to you. And stay tuned for the upcoming webinar within the ASPACT series in April, which will look at ASP from a gender perspective. So I will close here. I wish everyone a great day, morning, evening, wherever you are. And yeah, say goodbye here. All the best, and thank you a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.